Tech Nuggets, basic workstation and network diagnostic tools. Today we're going to talk about a couple of tools to use to interrogate your machine to get it to give you the network information that you need to know so that you can begin a diagnostic process. So this will be things about the host itself. What's my IP address? What's my host name? Basic statistics that the computer should already have in order to be able to communicate with the rest of the world. It'd be sort of like saying, do I have tires? I'm ready to drive on the road because I've got tires in the car. Our first up here, we're going to talk about a Windows utility, ipconfig space/all. It's a Windows utility. That means, of course, it'll only work in Windows, but it will provide, at a command line, it will provide all the information that the system has about all the different Ethernet cards in the system. So IP addresses and host names and physical addresses and things like that. The second up is IP. IP is a very full-featured utility. You can do a variety of different things with it. It'll tell you a ton of different things. In our case, we're going to talk about one option that IP offers, which is IP space A. And at the command line, that will give us IP information about the host. So while IP can do a variety of other things, and we'll talk about those in other videos, in our case, we really just want basic information of what's my IP address for the Ethernet card or maybe cards in my system. An older utility that will do very similar things might be installed. Newer versions of Linux probably don't have it. They'll come with IP, but older versions of Linux will definitely have this ifconfig, and it will tell us very similar, although in a slightly different format, but will tell us the same kinds of things. What's my IP address? What's my hard drive address? What's my network mask? And things like that. Netstat will be talked about here, but will not be in the video. Netstat is a wonderful utility. We're going to have an entire video on how we use Netstat to get route tables in another video, but it is listed here because IP and ifconfig don't provide the same level of detail that the IP config for Windows will. The IP config for Windows will give a lot more detail that the two Linux commands will not. Netstat can provide that information, and like I said, we'll cover that in another video later. Alright, well, next up we're going to run some command line options that are going to tell us and interrogate the machine for its settings. So, what's my IP address? What's my network mask? What is the information that the machine knows about itself and can tell us? So different operating systems will have different ways. Windows has its way, Linux has its way. There are other, most pieces of equipment that are IP based will have some way to get this information out of them so that you can identify what they are. And in Linux, there are two ways. There is IPA, which will spit out this is local loopback, right? This is first Ethernet card. It has one, so it can basically talk to itself. And it should always have this IP address. 127.0.0.1 refers to yourself. That is you talking to you. Sounds odd. I'm not a computer programmer, but every single machine has a local loopback adapter, and there are all sorts of good reasons it will need that, and I am not going to go into them. The second one down here you can see is ENS33. And in Linux, these can change. These monikers can change depending on what hardware is installed in them. So are they Intel Ethernet cards or Netgear Ethernet cards? But IPA will tell you what the Ethernet card is called inside itself. Sometimes different flavors of Linux will call them ETH0 or ETH1, and the monikers won't change. It depends on the operating system and how it's been set up and configured. You can see here I highlighted its IP address, 10.101.1.97, and the slash notation next to it, /16, is its subnet mask. And there'll be lots of videos on what's a subnet mask and how does it work and that kind of stuff. And we're not going to go into that here, but that is how you would find a subnet mask using IPA. Its broadcast address here is next to it. And if you know anything about subnet masks, then the broadcast address will make sense as to what it is. We can also find things like its hardware address, its MAC address. Unfortunately, that term MAC gets used several different ways. But a MAC address, that number is physically burned into the Ethernet card. It is the physical uniqueness of an Ethernet card. They're done in hexadecimal, they're quite long. Manufacturers get issued big long lists of them to put in their equipment, but anything that has an Ethernet card, wireless, wired, will have a MAC address, and that's how we Later, we'll talk about tools where we glue the physical world of this MAC address to the virtual world of an IP address. IP addresses can move to different pieces of equipment, but MAC addresses are pretty much permanent. There are ways to play head games with that. That's not always true, but in a normal operation of a normal network in the world, a MAC address is a physical characteristic of an Ethernet card and does not often change. So this was IP-A. The other way to look at this is ifconfig, which I didn't install. So I will install it quickly. And install NetTools. We don't use this tool as much anymore, but you can find it on older hardware, and it's still pretty useful. So there we go, ifconfig. And it's going to spit out basically the same information, right? ENS33. We saw that up earlier. It's going to spit out its IP address. Its network mask is in a different format, but it's the same thing. If you'll recall, this is a /16, so 255 in binary would be 8 ones and 8 ones, so that's where the /16 would come from. Broadcast address would be here. In this case, we'll see its hardware address is also listed. And we get some different information. So ifconfig sort of spits out slightly different information. We also see local loopback. Again, there's no physical to a local loopback because it's a software construct, but it's still effectively the same thing as it was in IPA. It's still loopback. They're the same ways of looking at, they're different ways, sorry, of looking at the same hardware. All right, let me flip over to Windows, and we'll look at its version of this, which is called ipconfig. And if you do ipconfig, you'll get the summary version of all the Ethernet cards, and that won't show you everything. Oftentimes we're looking for information that's a little deeper, so we put a /all on it, which will show us all of the information about each Ethernet card. So, and it can spit out, depending on how many Ethernet cards you have, it can spit out a lot of information. So it'll start at the top with just basic, what does it know about the machine, what's its DNS suffix and things like that. But as we come down in here, you can see it's got, this is the name of the Ethernet card. If you went and looked at the list of Ethernet cards in the machine, you'll find one called Ethernet 0. In Windows, it is renamable to something else. But you'll come down here and you'll find it's got its IP address. It's got a subnet mask. It's got some variety of other information that we'll get into, and its default gateway, things that we might get later out of netstat. Some of that in Windows we can get here out of ipconfig. You'll notice it's got DNS servers listed. We didn't see any of that in Ubuntu. There are ways to get that out of Linux. Windows kind of puts it all in one place, but there are different tools. Netstat does a ton of this kind of stuff in the Linux world, and you can do it in Windows too. But you'll see there's hardware address also listed in here for its hardware address. You'll notice that the Bluetooth adapter is listed, and it has a hardware address. Yes, and if you've ever done those kind of things with your Android or iPhone, you can transfer files via Bluetooth, and that's why it shows up as an Ethernet card. You can do the same thing in Windows or Linux. You can use them as short-range, local, physically close kind of Ethernet cards, and that's why they'll show up. We'll also see some of that depending on what version of Wireshark, like what it's running on. You may see it as an Ethernet device in Wireshark later.